Hey, my name's Tony, and I created a YouTube channel called Diaspora. This channel hopes to look at the experiences of different diaspora groups from ancient times to the modern era. In this video, I'll be looking at the Latin American community and the diaspora that have settled in Australia, a history that stretches further back than you might think. Looking at the Latin American community as a whole, there are 37 million Latinos of all nationalities living outside their home countries. And 37 million people is a lot. If you consider another prolific diaspora community, the Chinese, and how many of them live abroad, they amount to over 40 million. However, this might be a question of how statisticians define diaspora groups that lead to these numbers. In any case, Australia has received a very modest number of Latin Americans who migrate to their shores. So where do Latin Americans go if not lovely Australia? Well, the answer is kind of obvious. North America has the highest population of Latin Americans, but Europe has also received its fair share. A good portion of these Latin Americans accessing passports due to their ancestral connections, such as to Italy or Spain. Despite the relative ease of travel to Europe and North America, some Latin Americans have dared to travel to Australia. At the time of making this video, Chile is the doorway between these two continents and the main transit point for Latin Americans coming to Australia. Buenos Aires used to have its own transit point as well to Australia, but Aerolíneas Argentinas, the national carrier for Argentina, cancelled their Australian route in 2014. Air New Zealand picked up the route, but then they cancelled it in 2020. A direct flight from Sydney or Melbourne to Santiago, Chile is about 11,340 kilometers or over 7,000 miles away, which with the large number of Brazilians and Colombians that have migrated to Australia in recent times, I dare say another transit point on the Latin American continent seems inevitable. Australia is a continental island, making cross-border migration almost impossible, unlike the United States, for example, which received a large number of migrants over its land borders from neighbouring countries. Australia has greater control over who enters the country. This has influenced the kinds of migrants and Latin Americans that have arrived to Australia, as well as the circumstances in which they have been allowed to migrate here. To illustrate this point, Indonesia is only just over 1,300 kilometers or over 800 miles from Australia's most northern city, Darwin. However, Indonesia, a country of over 200 million people, that's 80 million more than Mexico, don't feature amongst the top 5 or even top 10 places of birth of Australian migrants, according to a 2020 census. So rewinding the clock 130 years ago, let's look at what the census shows us then about Latin Americans in Australia. As we can see from the table below, Latin Americans have been in Australia for some time, albeit not in large numbers. So what were they doing here in the mid-19th century? From the 1850s, Latinos as well as other nationalities from Europe and Asia were lured to Australia's gold rush, which was centered around the southeast of Australia, and they worked either directly or indirectly with the mining of gold. There was some backlash against non-Anglo-Celtic foreigners at this time, which we'll get into shortly, but it was the Chinese that bore the brunt of this resentment. The history of Latinos in Australia reaches further back than the 1891 census. On the 3rd of July, 1837, a group of 5 Chileans, one of them being an ex-president, Ramon Ferrier, who was exiled in a military coup, arrived in Sydney, and he was not the last famous Chilean figure to step foot in Australia. Now, rewinding the clock 50 years ago from the present time, the White Australia policy ended in 1972, and the migration policy was to solidify Australia's migration code up to that point. The White Australia policy was clear and explicit in its intention, and that was to ensure that Australia did not lose its European Anglo-Celtic identity. However, the abolition of the White Australia policy in 1972 led to an influx of non-white migrants, Latinos representing a small portion of this migration. In 1973, a bipartisan parliament agreed to accept people from Chile as refugees. Between 1974 and 1981, about 6,000 Chileans were taken in, and many more thereafter, until the ending of military rule in 1990. The wave of political refugees also included Uruguayans, and Argentinians who were fleeing oppressive dictatorial governments at the same time. In 1975, during the time when Australia was opening up, Michelle Bachelet, who became the first female president of Chile, lived in exile in Sydney for 6 months. In 1978, new categories of migration opened up, that is, skilled migration and family reunions, which opened up different avenues that brought over Latinos to Australia. The relaxed entry requirements permitted families to be reunited, which saw a surge in Latin Americans coming to Australia. Moving to the late 1990s, and at a much faster pace in the 2000s, international students from Latin America found avenues to migrate to Australia permanently. This saw an increase of Latinos from previously underrepresented groups, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, and Ecuador. Most of the members of this new migration wave have impressive credentials and were prepared to fill important gaps in Australia's labour force. As of 2016, there were over 180,000 Latin Americans either by descent or by birth. And as you can see in the table, the top 5 Latinos living in Australia are Brazilians, Chileans, Colombians, Uruguayans, and Argentinians. The Brazilian population saw the greatest increase in the shortest period of time, surpassing the traditional sources of migration from Latin America, that is Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay. Of note is the recent surge of Venezuelans living in Australia. Prior to 2001, there were fewer than 1,000 residents in the country. Due to historical wealth and prosperity, Venezuela was actually a recipient of migration, but hard times have led Venezuelans to seek stability and opportunities abroad. Between 2006 and 2011, Venezuelans became one of the fastest immigrant populations in Australia. According to a 2006 census, there were 5,460 Venezuelan-born residents living in Australia, 73% of whom arrived between 2006 and 2016. Thank you for watching my video on the Latin American diaspora in Australia. If you'd like to learn more about diaspora groups in Australia and in other countries, please sign up to this channel. Thank you. Bye.